The Russian Orthodox Church is often criticized for her political ambitions, ideological support of Putin's regime, corruption, and oftentimes for her history in the 20th century. Many claim that the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is a project of the KGB, the infamous Soviet secret police. Although most of the KGB archives are still classified by its successor, the FSB, and we will probably not learn the truth anytime soon, let me discuss the pieces of evidence that we have in the recent Soviet and Russian history. After that, you can decide for yourself whether and to what extent we can call the Church a KGB project. The Church's political ambitions are nothing new. The official political ideology of the Church uses the idea of symphonia, the harmonious co-rulership of Russia by the secular power and the Church. In practice, the secular state almost always prevailed, with two notable exceptions: the tandem of Tsar Mikhail Romanov and his own father Patriarch Filaret, and Tsar Alexei with an ambitious Patriarch Nikon, who eventually was suspended and dethroned. Since that time, the secular power has taken over the Church and rapidly broke all the Church's ambitions. The Church was made into a state department by Peter the Great, the Patriarchate was abolished, Church lands and peasants were confiscated. After the abdication of the last Romanov, Nicholas II, the Church could restore the Patriarchate, but less than a year later, the Bolshevik power separated the Church from the state and education. After the death of the first Patriarch in 200 years, Tikhon, in 1925, the Church was under the pressure of unfolding persecution, and for 20 years there was no opportunity to call for the council that would elect a new Patriarch. Since 1936, and until his election as the Patriarch, the placeholder was Metropolitan Sergei. Sergei was a controversial figure, and his term as a placeholder and the Patriarch started the narrative of the KGB Church. First, in the 1920s, 1930s, the Church experienced a very painful schism initiated by the Bolshevik state. The state-supported renovationist movement attempted radical reforms in Church and called for compliance with the Soviet state and its ideology. See a video about renovationists on my channel. Metropolitan Sergei sided with the schismatics, although he eventually formally repented when they lost. Another controversial act of Metropolitan Sergei was the Declaration of 1927. When the renovationist schism was still going on, Sergei issued a proclamation to all bishops, priests, and the faithful of the Church. He signed the proclamation as a deputy to Metropolitan Pyotr Polyansky, the patriarchal placeholder. The proclamation called the clergy and the faithful to obedience to the state and compliance with the state ideology. Although the proclamation acknowledged that the Soviet state was atheistic, Orthodox Christians were called to be good, compliant citizens. Besides, the immigrant Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was called to recognize the Soviet state, commemorate its leadership and liturgy, and be loyal to it. This proclamation almost led to a new church split. Many fractions and even eparchies of the Church fiercely opposed the proclamation. Until the bloody repressions of the 1930s, the majority of the Church clergy still saw the Soviet regime as temporary and could not recognize any superiority of the anti-religious ideology over the ancient Russian Church. On the other hand, Sergei, representing the Church leadership while Metropolitan Pyotr and many important bishops were incarcerated, was pushed to not only obey the state, but also to register her governance structures, such as the Holy Synod. Since the separation of Church and state in 1918, most of the Church structures did not have a legal status, which allowed the state to close or prosecute them arbitrarily. The severe repressions of the 1930s made no difference between different fractions of the Church, and the leadership of all religious movement in the country was practically destroyed. However, during the second phase of the World War, when the Soviet army took the initiative over Nazi Germany, the Soviet authorities launched a campaign for the partial liberalization of religion. One of the first steps in that direction was the restoration of the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. This led to the third serious accusation against Sergei by his critics. In 1943, Stalin sent a high-ranked officer of the MGB, future KGB, Georgy Karpov, to bring Sergei and his staff from evacuation to Moscow. Karpov would later become the head of the Council for the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church. More on this later. Sergei and two other bishops, one of whom would later become Patriarch Alexei I, met with Stalin. In the meeting, they decided to call the Archbishops' Council to elect the new Patriarch, 18 years after the death of Tikhon. For this council, Stalin and the MGB authorized the release of incarcerated bishops who were still alive and not in the Nazi-occupied eparchies. Altogether, there were 19 bishops at the council. For the perspective, nowadays there are about 400 bishops. The council elected Sergei a patriarch. Most of the criticism of that council and the patriarchate of Sergei refers to the small number of bishops, very problematic canonically, and the fact that the council was initiated, organized and controlled by Stalin and his secret service, the MGB. For most contemporary critics of the unholy alliance of the Church and the KGB, the election of Sergei is the milestone when the Church allegedly sold out to the atheist state. Patriarch Sergei died less than a year after the election, and Alexei Simansky became the next patriarch in 1945. During his whole tenure, which ended with his death in 1970, he expressed the most loyalist views and positions of the church leadership. Until Stalin's death in 1953, he played an important role in Soviet foreign policy, personally visiting Eastern Orthodox patriarchates and trying to put them under the influence of the Moscow Patriarchate. He also played an instrumental role in the abolishment of the Greco-Catholic churches in the Soviet Union and usurping their parishes. This operation was planned and executed by the secret services. After the death of Stalin, Patriarch Alexei served a memorial liturgy, during which he praised Stalin's genius and legacy. Later on, control over registered religious communities was established through the Councils for Religious Affairs. During Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign, the church was controlled by the Council for the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church, headed by high-ranked KGB officers. At first, Alexei tried to negotiate with the Council and personally with Nikita Khrushchev, but realized the futility of his appeals. He mostly complied with restrictions. In 1961, the Council initiated an Archbishops' Council and pushed the limitation of the role of bishops in their eparchies to mostly religious affairs. All finances and governance were shifted to the lay church staff appointed under state control. The reform was formally proposed by future Patriarch Pimen, and most of the bishops were forced to sign the decision. Some of the bishops attempted to appeal the decision in 1965, a year after their displacement of Khrushchev, but they did not succeed and were prosecuted. Alexei died in 1970 during the 6th year of Leonid Brezhnev's rule. Many of the bishops of the Soviet period have been accused of being way too obedient and compliant with the atheistic state. Patriarchs Sergei, Alexei, and Pimen, the most important bishops such as Nicodim, and even future patriarchs Alexei II and Kirill, all were important actors in the state policy, both foreign and domestic. Many of the bishops were alleged KGB agents with code names leaked by dissident priests and laymen. At the same time, not only political but also ecclesiastic opposition was oppressed. Many dissident or simply independent priests were punished by the church and prosecuted by the state. Priests Nikolai Eshliman, Gleb Yakunin, and Yakov Krotov were defrocked by the church for their political activism. Another liberal priest, Alexander Meny, whose works influenced a generation of clerics, religious thinkers, and artists, was pressured by the authorities for his connections in dissident circles. Eventually, in 1990, he was killed, and his murder is still unsolved. In the 1990s and early 2000s, most of the criticism towards the Church concerned corruption and the Soviet past. However, since the election of Patriarch Kirill and the build-up of his controversial relationships with President Putin, the criticism of the KGB Church is once again in the mainstream. The persecution of hundreds of dissident priests, mostly for their anti-war position, and the overwhelming support of the Russian military and especially various law enforcement agencies, including the descendants of the infamous KGB, give critics all the reasons to believe that the Russian Orthodox Church we know now is not the millennium-old church with the roots in the Christianization of Rus, but rather the state-controlled organization founded in 1943 by the Stalin's initiative. In conclusion, however, I want to remind you again that the Church is much more than her leadership and formal structures. Whether her patriarch and bishops are in fact agents of the state influence or even recruited agents of the secret police or not, most of the priests, monks and lay congregants are genuine believers who love their mother church, the assembly of the faithful and the body of Christ. Please like the video, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. I see you all next time.